Hello, my name is Michelle Farina, and I'm going to be reviewing my abstract GOT02, the relevance of oxygen to fluid shifting. And what inspired me to put this abstract together was the observation over several years that we really don't pay too much attention to our patients' oxygen saturations while they're dialyzing. Maybe they do it more in the acute environment, but certainly not so much in the chronic environment. So I just wanted to kind of emphasize the importance of oxygen to helping fluid shift into the vascular space. So of course, a function of hemodialysis is to remove excess body water from the extracellular compartment. That's dialysis 101, right? We all know that. But to achieve that goal, fluid has to move from inside of the cell or the intracellular compartment to the outside of the cell or the extracellular compartment. Now that's going to require energy. And that energy is going to come in the form of ATP. Remember that ATP is the energy currency of the body. And the body is going to generate the max number of ATP molecules through the process of aerobic cellular respiration. Remember hearing about that maybe many years ago if you got out of school a while ago. There's aerobic cellular respiration and there's anaerobic cellular respiration. In aerobic cellular respiration, we've got oxygen on board, right? It's in the title. And that's where we're going to get the most number of ATP. So just remembering that aerobic cellular respiration requires oxygen. So here's what it looks like, a flow chart that I put up here. So, and I don't want anybody, like shutting down to me right now because I'm not going into any details. I just want to get to the point where I can emphasize the importance of oxygen, where it kicks in and just how important it is. So you've got glucose, right? And that's going to break down through the process known as glycolysis. At the end of glycolysis, you're going to get a net 2 ATP molecules. And you're also going to get an electron carrier molecule. That's that NADH there. Then those end products of glycolysis are going to move into the Krebs cycle, where I'm going to get another 2 ATP and a few more of those electron transport carriers. That's the NADH and the FADH2. So overall right now, I have like 4 ATP, not much. It's going to be in the next phase called oxidative phosphorylation. That's where I'm going to get my max number of ATP. And again, it's oxidative, right? So it's oxygen. That's where oxygen is going to be swooping in, making its grand appearance and moving on the chain so that we can get the max number of ATP. So within the oxidative phosphorylation stage, we've got the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. So what happens is, those electron transport carrier molecules I was talking about, that NADH and that FADH, they come in at the start of the electron transport chain and they're releasing electrons and proton, okay? So those electrons are then going to move down a chain. When it gets to the end of the chain, we've got these free-floating electrons. We can't have that. Something has to come in and bind to those electrons. And that little something is going to be oxygen. Oxygen is going to come in at that point. It's going to grab those electrons. It's going to bind with hydrogen, and we're going to get water molecules. Then from there, the phase will continue into chemiosmosis, and that's where we're going to get that max number of ATP production. If that oxygen were not to come in to grab up those electrons to form those water molecules, that whole chain would shut down. If the chain shuts down, we're not going to get to that last stage, that chemiosmosis, and we're not going to create all of those ATP molecules. And you could just imagine, again, with ATP being the energy currency of the body, everything's going to shut down if that happens, right? But I'm going to be very specifically talking about how this could affect fluid shifting. So you might be thinking to yourself, because I've been challenged on this before, well, water moves passively. So I don't know what you're talking about with this energy, because it just moves passively across the semipermeable membrane. And that's true. But what we have to remember is sodium does not passively cross across the semipermeable membrane. That's going to require active transport to pump sodium out of the cell against its concentration gradient. That's why it's active transport. We need ATP for active transport to occur. So that ATP is going to fuel what's known as the sodium-potassium pump. Okay, and then what's going to happen is that through active transport, that ATP is going to kick out 3 sodium molecules for every 1 ATP. All right, so once that happens, once we get sodium outside of the cell, what do we know about sodium? Water is always going to follow sodium, right? So that's how we're going to get fluid out of the inside of the cell and eventually into the vascular space so that we can remove it during hemodialysis. So here's just a little diagram of that. And it's not the best, but it's the best one that I could find that I would be allowed to use. So if you look at these little orange symbols, hopefully you can see my arrow there. But the orange represents sodium, and then you've got these ovals here that represent potassium. And I'm not really going to be talking about potassium because I'm focusing on the sodium and the fluid shifting, okay? So you can see here, right here, I can see I've got 3 sodium molecules, right? And then if I look over here, here's my ATP, and you can kind of see that ATP just kicking those 3 sodium molecules outside of the cell to the extracellular compartment, which is here. And then again, water is going to follow that. And that's happening because we've got the ATP that's fueling that active transport, that's pushing that sodium across the cell. So let's say we didn't have that ATP. What would then happen? If we didn't have ATP to fuel that sodium potassium pump and get sodium out of the cell, sodium's going to stay within the cell. And then what's going to happen? Water, again, is going to follow sodium. And that water is going to stay inside that cell. And with time, that cell is going to swell. And if something doesn't change, that cell is going to burst. We're going to get cellular death. And we're not going to be able to obviously shift fluid into the vascular space. So if oxygen's lacking, if we don't have enough oxygen on board, we're not going to be able to make enough ATP, so we'll have decreased ATP production. If we have decreased ATP production, then we can't fuel active transport. We can't fuel the sodium-potassium pump. If we can't fuel the sodium-potassium pump, I can't get sodium outside the cell. If I can't get sodium outside the cell, I can't get water outside the cell. And it can't move into the vascular space where it needs to be to remove it during hemodialysis. So all of that, just to be able to confidently say, yes, oxygen is certainly required to create the energy it will take to shift fluid across compartments into the vascular space so it can be removed during hemodialysis. It's really that complex and that simple all at the same time. So I hope that this presentation was enlightening for you. I hope you got some good information from it. And I hope it inspires you to maybe be paying closer attention to our patients' oxygen saturations during the hemodialysis treatments. Thank you so much.